Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you're at. Thank you for clicking on this video today. My name is Matthew Bonnick, and this is another video in the CDK releases series. In this series, I talk about the most recent CDK release, the new features, bug fixes, and things that you need to know. So in this episode, we're actually going to be covering two versions. We're going to be covering 2.26.0 and 2.27.0 because I didn't get to create the 2.26 video before 2.27 was released, so I'm just going to roll them together into one video today. All right, so let's just jump right into this. So again, we're going to cover both 2.26.0 and 2.27.0 because they were released within days of each other. So let's go start with 2.26. Here we're going to see, first off, AWS ECR assets support the platform option when building Docker images. I'm betting this is going to be a real useful one, right? So if you're using a new Mac M1, Max, or other ARM-based processor, then certainly before you've probably come across an issue where building a Docker image means that you have to then run that in a specific ARM64 host container. And this option is going to let you sit there and provide some build options in here. If we take a look, let's see what we have for files changed. So it looks like they just provide now a platform option right on the Docker image asset build, which you can specify as either a Linux AMD or a Linux ARM64 for the new Mac stuff. This is largely going to do with the runtime, but again, if you're going to be building things on a Mac M1, then you're going to want to go ahead and probably leverage this options on here from time to time. A little curious why they're still using a 3.6 here in this Docker file asset. I'm hoping this is just for snapshot testing because 3.6 is deprecated. You should definitely not be using that anymore. Next, we look at Lambda. So validate the function description length. This is probably just a little quality of life feature so that if you end up providing a description that's far too long for AWS or CloudFormation, it's going to go ahead and throw a preemptive error on you so you don't have to worry. That way you get a preemptive error before you actually do a deploy, because it's really annoying to have to find problems like this during the deployment process and not during the actual testing of your code. So this will just check to make sure it's not longer than 256 characters. Next up, S3 adds object size greater than property for the S3 lifecycle rules. So it looks like this is going to give us a option to provide an object size greater than some number. So if you're setting up your lifecycle rules on your S3 buckets, this will give you that option to provide that lifecycle rule in there. I don't personally use lifecycle rules too much, but I probably should use them a lot more than I currently do. And finally, service catalog. The product stack history can retain old product stack iterations. So not knowing really enough about service catalog here, this is going to be probably some blind poking around. So adding enhancement to the product stack to allow the specification of a versioning strategy. Versioning strategy, retain previous versions added to save previously deployed product stack templates in a local context directory. These product versions can then be easily be deployed using the stored templates. Otherwise, we got some good examples. It looks like they're still using some v1 style examples, which is certainly interesting. Again, v1 is now deprecated. You definitely want to be moving to v2, and v1 is in maintenance mode. All right, so that's it for the features. We'll cover the bug fixes really quickly. Probably won't dive too much into these. So nested stacked default child is undefined. So if you're ever using escape hatches and you have to go to the underlying constructs, default child is a really great way to get to the one that you're probably looking for. And it looks like the nested stack didn't really have that defined well before, so now that's going to be an option. In the IAM module, role policies cannot grow beyond 10K. So yeah, IAM policies, there are some limitations there. It looks like this is probably going to be some changes in here. Let's actually dig into this one because this is always a good one. We add all role policy statements to the inline policy, which has a maximum size of 10K, especially when creating CDK pipelines. Yep, I've definitely run into this before on some very large pipelines that deploy to a lot of environments. The list of role ARNs the pipeline should be allowed to assume exceeds this size. Now, I've never personally run into that before with role ARNs. I'm usually only deploying to maybe about 3 or 4 environments at a time, but I could certainly see this being an issue. So roles also have the ability to have managed policies attached 10 by default, 20 with a quota limit. Yep, definitely. Each of them can be 6K in size. So by spilling over from inline policies into managed policies, we can get a total of 70,000 lines of statements attached, or 70K bytes, I'm assuming this is, of statements attached to each role. So it looks like this is probably a change so that they'll start optimizing the policies behind the scenes to using managed policies versus inline policies. Nice, again, quality of life feature. Lambda, so fixing a typo in a public subnet warning. Not even going to dive into that one. Subnet warning typos, fine. Too many. By the way, if you're ever interested in contributing to the CDK, those types of bug fixes can be really a great way to get started, because you don't have to worry about code change reviews and long PR review cycles and things like that. You can really focus on, just how do you make CDK code changes, because a typo is just typically a one character change. So you can kind of get your feet wet a little bit into doing CDK code changes with easy typo changes and things like that before really getting into maybe developing your own modules or changing functionality. So if you've been looking to get into the CDK development and you see a typo, try that as your first way of submitting a PR to the group. They love those types of PRs. Pipelines. So too many code build steps inflate the policy size. So similar to what we saw in the IAM one, there's probably a case where IAM policies have limitations, and as you start to build these things out more and more, we're running into those edge cases of running over those limits. And finally, S3 deployment, the default role does not get a put ACL permission on, well, let's find out what. So permission on the destination bucket when used with access control. Okay, so this is also with the feature flag. You no longer get S3 put object ACL and put object version ACL permissions in the default role. These are, however, required when using the access control properties. So I'm betting this is, let's see what the file changes were here. So if we are doing the props.access control, then on the destination bucket, we're going to also grant the put ACL. So sounds like kind of a catch there of if you're going to be using those access control options, then it's going to go ahead and automatically put in that ACL control for you, so you don't have to worry about permissions issues later. All right, so moving on to the alpha modules or the experimental stuff. So app runner gets a VPC connector construct. That's sort of an interesting one. Anytime you see a new construct being developed, definitely worth checking out here. So we create a new VPC connector construct and make the app runner service construct accept a VPC connector property. 28 files change. This is going to be a big one. We won't go through all of it, but we can see right here in the README of the module a good example of how to use it. We just go ahead and instantiate it with a VPC, the subnet selectors, and some sort of connector name there. And then we can start passing that around to our app runner service. So very cool. Always good to see new L2s getting added into your CDK. And finally, bug fixes around integ runner and integ tests. Again, if you haven't started using these, I recommend you try to build them into your pipelines. They're great ways of taking yourself to the next step of testing your CDK code. So we have unit testing that we've already had in for a while, as far as unit tests with fine-grained assertions and snapshotting tests. I really like the snapshot test myself. It just gives me a very quick and easy way of getting some sort of sanity check in my code. The fine-grained assertions are great, but generally I always end up going kind of with the snapshot tests anyway. The integ runner really makes it easy to go ahead and build these integration tests, or as I call them, deployment tests, where you go ahead and you deploy an actual example stack out into an environment, because that'll surface a whole slew of bugs and errors that you may have in your code that unit testing generally doesn't find. So the integ runner and integ test, definitely great to see that expanded out even more. All right, so the 1.158 was released at the same time. This was supposed to be the last version of version 1 in before going into maintenance mode, but we did see another version released which seemed to have features and changes and things like that. v1.158.0 has all pretty much the same changes as we saw in v2, so I'm not going to go into more details there. All right, so going to now 2.27.0. Again, these releases were 3 days apart. I was actually planning out the video for 2.26.0 when 2.27 came out. So I just decided to combine them here into one video instead of two. So digging into this, we've got breaking changes to the experimental features. So normally this is in the alpha. We don't usually see these breaking changes to experimental features much in the v2 because they've pushed off all the experimental modules into separate code. And they just call those alpha modules where you're expected to have breaking changes. But this one is around core. So this PR attempts to smooth around rough edges by locking the logical ID when export value is called. If the user attempts to override the ID after this point, an error message will be thrown. So this is probably a pretty edge case for a lot of people, where if you are going in and trying to work with cross-stack variables, so you have, say, a back-end stack, and the front-end stack needs to have some sort of value from the back-end, like an API endpoint URL or something exported from an ALB. The CDK is great at automatically exporting those values for you, but because you can override your logical IDs and that would inherently change your export value, well, this is a way of locking those down. They're trying to make it a little bit less likely to get yourself into a bad situation, because once you get into bad logical IDs and export values that are getting off, it can be a big pain to try to resolve those. So probably 99% of you would probably never even notice or care about this, but if you are doing a lot of work around overriding logical IDs, you'll probably want to watch out for this one. All right, so next up, we got some features. CFN spec updated to 73.1.0. Just a normal CFN spec update. Unless you're using L1s directly, probably nothing that'll affect you too much. Cognito OpenID Connect Identity Provider. So let's go dig into that and see what that does for us. So added the user pool identity provider OIDC class to create an OpenIDC connector identity provider for user pools. So if you're going to be using OpenID Connects and with Cognito, take a look at this for some examples of how to do that. Again, this looks like an all new L2. So we've got OpenID connectors now for user pools, great for doing some integrations and things like that. In the core module, so add to role policy for custom resource providers. Let's dig into that. I don't use custom resource providers too much, but they are very useful. So since we only get a singleton, we need a add to role policy method to add statements when the singleton is used for multiple custom resources. All right, so this one's probably worth really digging into more and more. So again, we got a good update in the README file. If we're using a custom resource provider, get or create a provider for a specific handler. Then we've got this add to role policy for, in this case, getting some objects out of any S3 bucket we've got access to. So note that the add to role policy uses direct IAM JSON policy blobs, not a policy statement. So that's interesting. I'm curious to why they went that way with it. If you're not familiar, normally when you're doing policies, you'll try to use grant methods, but if not, you will sometimes construct policy statements directly. In this case, though, you don't use a policy statement. You just pretty much copy and paste your IAM JSON policy. So notice here we've got capital E for effect, capital A for action, capital R for resource, instead of the typical lowercase JS and TypeScript standard conventions of lowercase for field names. So I'd be curious to why they went that method with this. And then finally in the code, we can just see that we're adding those things in here for the policy statements. All right, next up, Lambdas. Add Insights version 1.0.135.0. Looks like it closes out a extension issue. Let's go into this a little bit more detail. So this commit adds a Lambda Insights layer version 1.0.135.0 for x86 and ARM. Provide a couple of references. I'll bet you this is a pretty easy one here. So yeah, it looks like they're just adding in a new static reference to the 1.135. Previous one, I guess, looks like 1.19.0. And then we get all the various layer ARNs across all of our regions for those versions. So if you're using Lambda Insights, you might want to upgrade to that latest version, and now you've got that nice variable for doing it. Pipeline, so pass a role to the S3 source action. So implements the role property for S3 source, which is being passed down to the underlying S3 source action. Looks like maybe this was just oversight originally, I'm guessing, with some of the code where you just couldn't pass in that property. Now you can. So if you want to hand a role over to that S3 source action rather than just letting it use the one that's created by default, you can now do that. And then finally, on the new features, adds the object size less than property for the S3 lifecycle rule. I thought we saw this in the last version. Let's go to double check something. So object size less than. In the previous one, we had object size greater than. Okay, so we did the less than in the previous release. With this release, we get a greater than. I won't dive into that one, same as before probably. Next up, bug fixes. So we'll breeze over these real quick. Logical ID is consumed prior to being overridden. So this was the fix that we talked about at the very beginning with the experimental feature. If you're overriding logical IDs, be aware of this. ECR assets cannot build ARM images using modern stack synthesis. It's kind of interesting. Let's go into this. Added support for the platform option. Okay, so we saw this previously too. So you can provide that platform option to Docker so that you can tell Docker to build a specific platform, either ARM or AMD. ECS, can containers access instance role is ignored when passed in ASG capacity provider constructor. Probably a bug that someone found, someone dealing with a lot more capacity provider stuff than I am with ECS, but good to know if you're dealing with that on the ECS side. ECS, fix typo from the from service attributes to from service attributes. Yeah, real. Let's tell you what, let's zoom in so you can see on this as well. Looks like first time around we got 2 R's instead of 2 T's. So we get now the proper spelling. Great. Event bus IAM statements are only added for the first target. Well, that's definitely not great. So now I'm guessing they'll get added for all targets. IAM referencing the same immutable role twice makes it mutable. Lambda function version ignores layer version changes. This introduces 2 bug fixes that are hidden behind a feature flag to preserve the current hash. Lambda layer order is ignored by the hash now, and the Lambda version is included in the hash. So what was the original bug here? If my stack contains a Lambda layer version and a Lambda function with an alias pointing to the new version, content changes within the layer do not trigger deployment of a new function version. Well, that would be certainly annoying. So it looks like they got that fixed up. Very nice there. RDS, clusters created from snapshots, generates incorrect passwords. Oh, that would be annoying. I'm using a serverless cluster from snapshot to create cluster from a snapshot. For the credential, I tried both from generated and from generated password. I don't really know the difference between these 2 methods. Fair. It creates the cluster successfully, but I cannot connect to it with the generated secret in the secret manager. I tried the query database with the secret ARN, but no luck. Yeah, that would be annoying. So let's take a look. Lots of code changes here. So we got some, it looks like they're deprecating the credentials, and we're going to be using a new snapshot credential, so specifically calling that out. And now it looks like we got a lot of various codes, so annotations for the warning if you are using snapshot credentials, and then it goes through there, and there you go, just leverages that password if need be now. So that's very cool. All right, alpha module changes. So we got the integ runner, publish integ runner CLI. Cool, awesome. So we've now got that CLI out here to use. And then on the bug fixes, so catch snapshot errors and treat from file as command line. And finally, don't throw errors if test passes. So if you are leveraging this integ runner and these integration tests, I would love for you to comment in the video. Are you liking them? Are you using them? Are there problems that you're running into? If there are, what are they? Also, you can hit me up on Twitter at Matt Bonig, or you can reach out to me on the cdk.dev Slack. Not that I am part of the development team for this or anything. I just am kind of curious how you're using it and if you're liking it. All right, so that's it for the 2.26 and the 2.27 release notes. As always, if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. It helps me understand if you're actually liking and getting something out of these videos. If you are, you can also subscribe for when new videos come out. If you don't like them, give me a thumbs down, and please give me some constructive criticism back in the comments and let me know how I could be making these better in the future, because I am doing them for you. If you don't like them, let me know how to change. And as always, thank you for joining and watching this video, and I'll talk to you next time.